NetScience's president Joshua Liberman joins this week to share his insights on cyber liability, encryption, and 2023 vendor predictions, plus a special guest interview with compliance expert Mike Semel on the latest changes and regulations. It's ChannelPro Weekly number 250. All cyber insurance will be Taco Bell. Hello and welcome to ChannelPro Weekly, episode number 250. My name is Matt Whitlock, technology editor, online director, and your host of this fine show for folks out there like you, the VARs, the IT integrators, the managed services providers, the managed security services providers, the IT consultants, all of those things that have to do with technology and servicing technology needs with other businesses. That means you are in the right place. Welcome, welcome, one and all. Joining me this week and most weeks is the man of the hour, the guy who keeps everything running on time over here at ChannelPro, executive editor, Rich Freeman. Welcome, Rich.
Well, thank you very much, and happy holidays to you and everyone in our audience.
Yeah, good to see you. Good to see you. It's been a busy couple of weeks over at ChannelPro. We've had events and we've had all kinds of stuff. I'm sure we'll talk about that again a little bit. But at the top of the show, I did mention that you folks out there are IT integrators and all that stuff. Well, we have one of those types of people on with us today as our guest host. Very excited to have him back. He started PC Services in 1990, providing Novell networking and becoming a master CNE. Since starting NetSciences in 1996, he's built and secured hundreds of networks in New Mexico and the surrounding area. He's also been a rock and ice climber, martial artist, photographer. He's also an avid traveler that speaks 5 languages. He's raised Siberian Huskies. I mean, he's a very, very diverse, really cool guy. Please welcome the president and founder of NetSciences, Mr. Joshua Liberman. Welcome, Josh.
Thanks, Matt. I always wanted to ask you, at any point in your past, did you have a career as an auctioneer? I don't believe that I can speak as quickly, as clearly as you can, and I'm always impressed by how you do that.
It was my second calling in life was to be an auctioneer, but I ended up doing this instead. But I have said that I do speak very fast, and I try to slow it down, but I just don't seem to be able to.
I got you. Well, I'll be careful not to raise a paddle by mistake. Thank you for the introduction, and I think that pretty well covers it. I will say that we focus in New Mexico on small business, very small business by national standards, which is a little bit like a fish talking about focusing on water. But our market is, at NetSciences, we are primarily serving folks between 10 and 40 seats, but we have players as small as 2 and as large as 100. Our market really is I think our median size is about 25, but many are well below that. And it's just the market that we live in, and that many people in rural America or least densely populated states are serving as well. And that's the spice on top of the whole compliance story that makes it somewhat less digestible in our case at times.
Yeah, for sure. So I know we've talked in the past about some of the hobbies that you have, and we'll maybe put some links back to some previous shows so they can learn a little bit more about you. But what are you doing kind of these days? Where's your passion right now? What are you up to on outside of work?
Well, I write a lot, read a lot, and I do photography and do all that while traveling. So that sums it up pretty well. While I'm at home, you mentioned the Siberians. They are the most magnificent animals I've ever known, and they are endlessly amazing and enthusiastic about everything. They're a great counterpoint to being an IT security guy. I come home, I walk in the door, and all that stuff melts away. And there's currently 3 happy tails and 12 feet running around. Every morning, I'm an early riser, 5:30. I see them, and I am amazed that every day their attitude is dog food. That's my favorite. And the whole day just starts from there. Outdoors, indoors, whatever you want. That's the favorite thing. That's the best thing they've ever done, until a minute later when they can't remember that and something is new. But another passion certainly is to travel enough to really maintain a perspective. And I did a lot when I was young. Until my 30s, I'd already been to quarter to half the world. And I broke that halfway point in my 40s and 50s, and have continued since. I'm looking forward to the time in the not too distant future where I can pursue yet more again of that.
Audio there. I'm hearing you just fine, Josh. If we had a little more time, actually, because you have told me some very, very amusing stories about the Huskies, because they're not only enthusiastic and affectionate, they're very, very smart, from what I have heard about, and not for the faint of heart. This is, 2.0 level or 201 level dog ownership, from what I understand.
Well, it's a combination of attitude and intelligence and their ability to work as a team. Everybody knows about sled teams, but I can remember times where 2 of the 3 or 3 of the 4 at the time would distract you in various ways, while 1 or 2 of the other players, one of them got over a 6-foot fence because 2 of them distracted me, while 1 of them stood by the fence, the other one ran and jumped over the back, off the back and cleared it. And then that 4th dog, Luna was her name, she discovered not too long after that she could actually do that alone. So she learned to clear that fence on her own. I've had them climb fences, dig 2 feet under to get around fences. I'm pretty sure that, and by the way, Healers, which is one of my dogs, is a mixed Healer Husky. She's scary smart. I'm pretty sure she's an above average, would make an above average employee in the modern software industry. So yeah, they have that enthusiasm and teamwork pretty well honed.
Well, very cool. Well, I'm really glad that you're on here with us. We got a lot to go through. We got a kind of a cool show. I don't think we have a lot of excuse me. I don't think we have a lot of news to talk about, because it's kind of the end of the year and most of the news is pretty much done. But we do have some topics that we're going to talk about. We're going to be talking about keeping clear of cyber liability. That's something we're going to discuss. We're going to talk about encryption, whether to encrypt or not encrypt. We're going to be talking vendor predictions. We've got a fascinating interview coming up with Mike Semel from Mike Semel Consulting. We're going to be talking about a lot of changes and new developments in CMMC and HIPAA regulations. So it's going to be a pretty awesome show, and Joshua will be with us through it. So why don't we just dive in? Rich, let's get into our first story: keeping clear of cyber liability. What's that about?
Yeah, this is an article from our December issue, actually, that just went up on our website this week, which is funny, by the way, because I just wrote it last week. Usually there's a longer production cycle for these magazine stories. It's just weird to see it pop up on the website so quickly. The inspiration for it basically was, even if your customers do everything that you want them to do to secure themselves, they could still get breached, they could still get ransomware. And even if all the advice that you gave them to follow was good advice, you as an MSP or a ChannelPro can still get sued. So I mean, and MSPs have been sued by their customers following a security incident. And so the thought behind the article is, what are the things that our readers and listeners, viewers of this podcast can do to sort of reduce their legal attack surface, if you will, to reduce their vulnerability to legal action? Because one of the people I spoke to in preparing for this article was Bradley Gross, an attorney who works pretty much exclusively with MSPs. He's been on the show several times, including a few weeks ago, and he said, the question to ask isn't, am I going to get sued? It's, am I going to be liable? So in exactly the same way that, you know how you would react if a customer told you, I don't need to do these cybersecurity measures because no one's going to attack me and I don't need, it's a similar kind of thing with getting sued. You've never been sued before. You don't know an MSP who's been sued. Doesn't mean it couldn't happen. And when it does, it makes a huge amount of difference whether or not you're legally prepared for it or not. So some of the thing, and some of this is really obvious, and some of it really should be obvious, but maybe isn't. I think Brad said on this show once upon a time, there are actually MSPs out there doing business without a master services agreement. So right off the bat, let's just say, don't do that. That is a huge, huge legal exposure. So you've got to have an MSA. You got to work on it with an attorney. You have to be consistent about it. Don't negotiate the contents of your MSA. We're going to be talking with Mike Semel later in the show. He learned a technique from Brad Gross, actually, where with his clients, he gives them the MSA and then what he calls an engagement letter. And so anything that is specific to that customer gets written up in the engagement letter. And if there's something that needs to be negotiated, it's there, it's in writing, signatures are on it. But you don't negotiate the wording of your MSA. That's something that you've carefully prepared and you leave it as is. Gosh, what else here? I have the pages out of order. You want to make sure, and this is another one of these things that should be super obvious, but isn't. Do you have insurance? Do you have tech errors and omissions, tech E&O insurance in place? Not everybody does. That's what's going to protect you from an incident like this if one happens. Do your customers have cyber insurance? This, according to most of the people I spoke to, is something that you should require them to do. And part of the thinking behind that is you are most likely to get sued if there is no one other than you for the customer to sue in the event that they're breached and they suffer damages. And so you got to make sure that they are insured and make that a requirement of doing business with you. Some controversies, some differences of opinion about the familiar question of whether or not you should get your customer to sign what is officially called a declination of service letter. So if you say, here are the things that you need to do to be secure, and they say, I'm not going to do it because it's too expensive, or I'll never get attacked. Some people will make the customer sign a letter that says, I understand you've given me thus and such advice, but I'm declining that advice. I've spoken to people who said that's basically theater. It's not going to keep you out of a courtroom, and it may not carry much weight inside the courtroom. And I've others that said you want that paper trail in the event of legal action. Personally, if it's me and I'm an MSP, I'm getting the letter signed. Better, if it gives me a little bit of extra protection, I want it. Marketing materials. This is something that you might, your thoughts might go straight to contracts in terms of liability, but stuff that you say in your marketing materials on your website and so on that just feels like ad speak, like puffery as it's known to you, can be construed by a customer as a contractual obligation. If you say, we'll think about cybersecurity so you don't have to and take care of all your needs, and then they get attacked, it's like, well, you told me you were going to take care of all my needs. So you actually need to, and particularly for the really core marketing stuff, if you've got a brochure, certainly your website, you need to go through that with an attorney and make sure that you're not saying something in there that's going to leave you exposed later on. And per Brad Gross, it's a good idea to write into your MSA, anything that I told you in advertising or marketing and so on is for informational purposes only and does not, represent an obligation, et cetera. So you actually want to address the advertising and marketing issue in your contracts. If your customer gets breached anyway, some things you can do to at least make the situation less dangerous for you as well as for them. First of all, get in touch with that customer as soon as you know there's been a problem. Because again, hard as it is to believe, Brad has worked with MSPs who basically tried to hide the breach from the customer, weeks, months sometimes. It's like, let's just sweep it under the rug and hope nobody notices. Bad idea. Tell the customer immediately. Second call you place basically is to the cyber insurance firm, because they're going to have resources that can help you, but also certain things that they're going to require happen or not happen. It's going to make getting the claim paid a lot easier. And then you absolutely want to shut everything potentially compromised down. You want to cut the customer's systems off from the internet. But that's all you want to do. Basically, as Mike Semel, who we're going to hear from, says, that environment, that network is a crime scene, quite literally a crime scene. And just like you don't cross the yellow tape line at a physical crime scene and start moving stuff around, you don't want to tamper with anything on that network until investigators have had a look at it, the cyber insurance firm, and so on. So, shut things down so that further damage can't be done, and then leave everything the way it is. And in particular, be very scrupulous about preserving log files, because for forensic purposes, that information is going to be extremely useful. And not even just the network, the server log files, if the phone system is logging stuff and so on, any, the building access, anything that logs, you want to hang on to onto those files. So lots of good advice in this article, lots of food for thought.
Okay. I'd like to actually discuss some of those topics, 3 or 4 of them that you ran through just there.
Yeah.
Some of them to elaborate-ish, and some because I'm not positive we're on the same page about that, but I'm going to mostly work backwards in time and hope for the recency effect. You talked near the end anyway, about getting assigned declination of service. And actually, Brad has pointed out that I have tried to do that over the years. I stopped a year and a half ago or 2 years ago. Not many people will sign a letter that effectively says they're making a bad decision and that shifts the liability onto them for that bad decision. I have found that declination statements, we call them, or notifications, which I think Brad says, are helpful at times because they crystallize the concept in the mind of the people who are saying no. They see in writing, here is the risk, here is your acceptance of that risk in order to avoid doing the following. That's helpful and could be helpful, and occasionally might even be considered a sales tool. But I can honestly tell you that I've literally never had anybody do that for us. Nowadays we don't have opt-in, opt-out stuff, but we did for maybe 2010 to 2020. We had the ability to opt out of some things. We don't have opt-out now. Having said that, MFA has been the longest struggle of my life, literally 2 years of struggle. And I still have one site that utterly refuses to do it. And we're losing 3 sites over it this year. 2 I learned about today. So it is a struggle. That struggle is real, as they say. But declination isn't that helpful. And the other side of the story is, as you alluded to, they don't hold up very well in court. Again, Brad has talked about this, and I have actually talked to 2 people who had experience with this as defendants. The assumption in most courts, because remember, you're sitting in front of a judge who doesn't understand anything that's going on there, he's not a techie, is that you're the expert and it's on you to make sure that that site is secured. And if you're lucky and you get enough time to discuss that you can only go so far as the client lets you, you might have a shot. But a lot of those cases come and go quicker than that, and you're not even going to get to make that argument. So don't delude yourself into believing that a signed piece of paper, should you have it, or even an email or whatever it is enough. It's probably helpful. As you pointed out, Rich, you'd want that, but you're probably not going to get it. That's my experience. And if you do, it's not enough. So you really have to figure out, every customer is a risk assessment for you. It's what's the right word? A cost benefit analysis. If they're riskier, you need to be making more, or maybe they're a source of referrals to people who aren't so risky. You have to analyze, can I take the risk? What do I get for it? And then make that decision, and then probably review that decision every year like we do. The second thing you mentioned really quickly about cyber liability insurance in particular, and about getting people to sign off on that. In many states, it is illegal for you to require them to carry that coverage. It's been told to me, though I haven't verified it, that I'm living in one of those states. We don't require it, although I used to until 2020. What I do have is a statement that very clearly states that here's your exposure if you don't. We strongly advise that you do, and explicitly state that our own coverage, which we have, cyber crime and E&O, does not extend to their losses, period. No exception. And an indemnification clause later that further reiterates the same concept. So you have to make it clear that they're on the line for their losses, period. Well, that's defend you in court. Anybody who's actually been through the US court system understands that, generally speaking, laws are helpful, but the most highly paid law firm wins. And you have to realize that if your client is 20 times the revenue of your business, as this one I'm thinking of is, they're going to afford better representation than we are. And you have to, again, put that into your cost benefit analysis. But the other half of that question, most of us have a really good relationship with most of our clients. So we can safely say that, well, they're not going to sue us. And it might even be true. You pointed out that if they have no other cyber liability, Brad had pointed out to you that, hey, they're probably going to come after you because they have no other options. But it can be worse than that. It can be that they do have cyber liability insurance and it covered them for their loss. And now they're not suing you, their insurance company is. And they don't know you, and they don't care for you, and they don't care anything at all about your Siberian Huskies. So you have to realize that it may not be you versus your client. It may be you against a large corporation who does this for a living, at least part of their living.
And it's worth pointing out quick. I mean, that's it. It's interesting to hear you say that, because it comes up in the article. One of the attorneys I interviewed in preparing for this article actually described that as an advantage versus a disadvantage. So rather than going to war with your customer, the customer kind of just steps away. Not my business anymore. It's the insurance company. If you have to be involved in a lawsuit, this guy was saying better that it's you versus the insurance company instead of you versus your client.
I can understand that, and it makes sense because you don't risk the relationship, or at least don't necessarily risk it. It's tricky. The other comment that I wanted to make about this, that nobody really drives home enough, I think, is that if there is a breach for an insured company, you have to instantly stop. We all think like first responders, right? And when I went to EMT school, or experience things, you want to stop the bleeding, you want to set the bone, you want to keep somebody from extraordinary pain. Unfortunately, put out the fire. You can't do that anymore. Now the first call, you pointed out, should be to the client. I agree. But the second call must be to their insurance people. And the third call might very well be law enforcement, although that may be something that is in the hands of your client. Before any of this happens, you better have a plan. So if you do have incident response plans, they're going to be different depending upon whether they're covered by cyber liability or crime and the nature of the issue, because you're right, this is a crime scene and you have to treat it as such. Now, not so much if they're not insured, if they're not regulated, then it's more one-on-one. But ironically, the better insured and the better covered they are, the less you can do immediately. And you have to have that conversation. You have to memorialize it in writing somehow or another. And you have to have a plan if you can, so that they know that you're not going to run down there and start fixing things. And how long does it take their cyber liability insurance people to respond? How soon is somebody going to come out and do a site survey in New Mexico? How soon is somebody even going to respond to an email? None of them will respond as quick as you will. So you have to have that expectation set in advance. And that means that they also have to have some sort of business continuity insurance as well. I can't imagine a major breach at even a $5 million, $2, $3, $4 million company getting resolved in a week, maybe even 2. And I mean, from the insurance and legal standpoint, we could have fixed that in a day or 3, but that's not going to happen. They're going to be waiting for these wheels to grind, and you better have them prepared for that.
I'll make one last point about cyber insurance, following up on something you were talking about there before we have to kind of move on to our next story. But I'm sure there are people actually thinking about this too. So it's, what you were saying basically is no one's going to sign the declination of service letter, and obviously you will still do business with those companies even if they refuse to sign. Similar sort of thing. Like I'm not familiar actually with laws that might ban you from requiring cyber insurance. I'm curious to research that and learn more about that. But it's a similar kind of thing, given how hard it is to get insurance and how expensive it is to get insurance right now. There are going to be customers who yeah, I understand this is a good idea, but A, I can't get coverage, and B, I can't afford the coverage that's been offered to me. And so there will be those situations where it's like, well, I either accept that, and like you were saying, accept the risk that goes with it, or I walk away from every customer out there who is unable to get or afford insurance coverage. And that it's getting harder and harder, as we all know.
Yeah, I agree with that. And unfortunately, I think actually there might be an article coming out in February that touches on this in the next ChannelPro or the one after that. But one of the things that we found that was surprising is I really did think that it was a great thing for us as MSPs that cyber liability requirements were being tightened up all the time, and that there was the distinct possibility that this was the lever we were going to turn to bring people on board and to say, hey, let's do this. Unfortunately, what I've seen is quite the opposite. A lot of times these companies will look at the requirements and they'll calculate that to them it's not worth the investment. Okay, I won't get cyber liability insurance. It's expensive, and I have to do all these things I'm not doing now that all carry a cost, although frequently that cost is inconvenience, not an actual cost. But anyway, the bottom line is that it's still complicated. It's not a slam dunk by any means. But overall, I think it's been a real benefit that cyber liability actually brings to the fore some of these risks.
Very, very interesting. Yeah. Well, good insights there. Is a really good article. We'll make sure we put a link to this in the show notes page for 250. So if you're on your phone, you can open up the description area there. You'll find the links to these stories to kind of read everything. If you're on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell, and open up the description area there. We'll put the links there for you as well. Our next story that we're going to talk about is kind of an interesting one. I'm really going to be interested to hear Mr. Joshua's take on this, and that is to encrypt or not encrypt. Rich, tell us about this story.
So, and this is another one of those things where you find yourself wondering, wait a minute, there are people doing business without an MSA. There are SMBs doing business without encrypting any of their data. And yet there's a quote right at the beginning of the story about to encrypt or not to encrypt, in which Maria Scarmardo, who is CEO of Praxis Data Security, says, quote unquote, across the board, not encrypting anything is the most common thing ever. It happens a lot with SMBs. And some of that is just that they don't understand the implications of not encrypting data and sending it out over the internet. The security by obscurity kind of thing. I'm not going to get attacked. I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to spend the money. The confusion about what should or shouldn't be encrypted, and whether, does everybody, do I need to get a VPN for everybody basically at the company here? Or so it's one of those things that is second, third, fourth nature to anyone who works in or around the IT industry, that can be kind of confusing for SMBs. And then there are some cost implications and certainly some performance indications, depending on what we're talking about here in terms of encrypting and decrypting data all the time. And so, the question is, well, what do you encrypt? What don't you encrypt? And so on. And that actually, all of this is actually an opportunity for the ChannelPro to better serve their customer and make a bit of money by getting into this a little bit with their customers. So you don't necessarily need to encrypt everything. Now, what you need to encrypt is going to vary depending on what vertical industry you're in and what regulations you're subject to and so on. But, if you're in retail, it's a requirement that you're going to be encrypting the PCI data. If you're in healthcare, there are HIPAA requirements and so on and so forth. But everybody has got, some form of intellectual property, financial records, PII of some kind for their end users. And so, but the businesses themselves really don't understand what is most at risk and what is where it really does or doesn't make sense to encrypt the data. And so that's an engagement. That's something where you can kind of come in and guide them on that a little bit, and hopefully persuade them to accept or implement a strategy that you've sketched out for them. There are, and I was saying there can be cost implications to this in addition to the performance implications. But you look at the Microsoft tool set just as for example, and there are encryption capabilities that are sort of built in, and you're not paying extra and so on. It's not necessarily a huge expense. I think it's more an issue of awareness, and then if there are any inconveniences involved around performance and lag time and that kind of thing, that can be an issue as well. But just another one of those food for thought kind of stories. And I'll kind of hand it over to Josh here and sort of kick it off with, I mean, how many of your customers should be encrypting stuff that they just don't encrypt?
Well, wow. Once again, that was a whole lot. What I'm going to say is we're lucky enough at this point to know that all of our mobile endpoints are encrypted. So, and it's because we mandate it. If they're using a laptop or a tablet convertible, it's going to be encrypted. So that's good. We also have some machines sitting at rest that are. I want to point out that you didn't differentiate between encryption at rest and encryption in transit. And it's important detail. For example, virtually nobody's going to go and buy something online without being inside an SSL state session. So that encryption is kind of built in And we're going to talk about how that touches on BitLocker in a second. But that's there, and that's a given. And it's a good lever for us because I explain to people, you already experience encryption in a transparent manner all the time. You don't deal with Southwest, Amazon, or anybody else without an encrypted session. It makes perfect sense to you because they get how there's risk there. They're exchanging credit card information and more sensitive things over the open internet. At least most people will get that. But it's at rest that matters. And here's our lever for the at rest. In many states, ours is included, if there is a theft of equipment that has potentially either protected information on it or could be used as a gateway to gain access back into a network with potentially protected information on it, that loss has to be reported. It does not if that machine that was lost or stolen have been encrypted. Now, it does if the encryption keys are stolen with it, but that's typically not an issue. What is an issue is that you can tell people, this is reputational protection, this is procedural protection, this is going to save you a lot of heartache. If somebody comes in and steals your stuff, you don't have to report it if that stuff is encrypted. Now, you also have to document it. So when we do our encryption, here's where we talk about BitLocker. We do use BitLocker. Fortunately, Microsoft figured out that needs to be in the professional version of Windows, not just the enterprise version when we went from Windows 7 to Windows 10. Windows 8 never existed. But anyway, Windows 10 and Windows 11 Pro include integrated BitLocker. And it is possible through registry manipulation, group policies, RMM products, or third-party tools like the one we use to not only encrypt these devices, but to escrow the keys and to set up alerts if something becomes decrypted and track and document the fact that you do have and did have encrypted machines. So that's a great thing. There's really almost no cost to that. If you use the third-party tool, there's that monthly cost. If you do it by means of RMM reporting and manipulation and scripting, then there's an initial time cost to you, the provider, but the end users don't feel it. You also spoke quite a bit or mentioned several times performance. So we did testing here when I decided that our endpoints are going to be encrypted several years ago. If you were sitting even then on a Gen 7 or 8 Core i5 machine with 8 gig of memory and a SATA SSD, not NVMe, the performance difference with Windows 10 Pro was in the single digits. There was virtually nothing that was detectable, but there were measurable differences. At this point, with a Core i5 or i7 16 gig and NVMe, which is our baseline, everything we do is that or up. Core i5 16 gig NVMe. There's no measurable difference in performance that we can find. We haven't really drilled down into high performance numeric applications or 3D modeling. It's probably in there somewhere, but it's small enough that people won't see it. So you could forget about that part of it. Now, this is different from encrypting in real time on a server, and there is more overhead there, but we tend to overbuild servers also quite a bit more than desktops. So I don't even believe you're going to see that as an issue. So I don't think performance should come up and cost can be managed. The real issue is that you have to implement the policy, be consistent, and document it. Once you're there, I see no downside to this. We do encrypt everything we can. We're probably up to half of our endpoints everywhere, whether they're mobile or stationary, office bound, are encrypted, and next year everything will be. There's just not a downside left. When it required enterprise Windows 7 or when it required expensive tools or there was a real overhead hit, sure, it was the discussion. Now I don't really see the argument, but none of this solves the problem of data exfiltration or ransomware 2.0, where people grab your data, they exfiltrate some of it, they ransom you to get your local data decrypted so you have access to it again. But many people, even SMBs, now have good protections against that. They have actual somewhat immutable backups that they can recover from. That doesn't protect you against exfiltration. And unfortunately, neither does running BitLocker on your local machine, because the process of exfiltration decrypts that. I mean, it comes off the machine in a decrypted stream, I guess is the way to describe it. So that's the next thing. That's the next frontier for me of encryption is how do you embed not OS level encryption, but a level of encryption above that such that exfiltrated data is no longer useful to the theft, to the people performing that theft. I don't have an answer to that. Don't take me wrong, or I would be doing that instead of this. But I think that that's coming. And I actually talked about this with a vendor in the industry that's looking at something in Q1. So that would be awesome. But the quick answer is, yeah, just do it, right? Just encrypt stuff. I'm sure there are some examples that'll make you wonder about it, but there's not a big cost. There's not a big performance cost. There's not even much of any performance cost. And it helps you with regulations that you might otherwise have to deal with if there is a breach. And finally, there are other things. I mean, if you're supporting HIPAA compliant folks, they ought to be encrypting everything anyway, period. And then document the hell out of it.
Very interesting. Yeah, if you figure out how to do the other top layer of encryption and exfiltration, you'll be a very rich man.
Well, if I figure out how to make money doing it. Yeah, because there's a lot of good science out there. There's not quite as much good engineering, but we'll see. I mean, I know that people are working on it. I'm sure if I know of some of them, there's 10 to 1. You know, there's a lot on it, but yeah, I just encrypt the hell out of stuff. It gets trickier on the servers. A lot of us have struggled with self-encrypting drives or encrypting RAID controllers. There are, that's harder to do, but even in our smallest sites, we have a chassis, and some of them are even bolted to the floor, and they're locked, and there's servers in there, and it's less likely that somebody will walk out the door of that server. And at many sites, there aren't servers all around the country now. So really, we're dealing with endpoints. So you encrypt that endpoint, you encrypt the communications. SSL VPN tunneling is a wonderful thing for sure. You just keep everything encrypted in flow or in motion, as well as wherever it's stationary, and move forward.
It's good advice. It's good advice. Thank you for those insights. Very cool. I know we're running a little bit long, so why don't we get to our next story real quick, so that way we have a little bit of time to close the show out. So, Rich, we got in the notes here, we want to do some vendor predictions for 2023. How do you want to do that?
Well, this is one of those things that in my line of work, death taxes and predictions for the new year from vendors. I get, lots and lots of them this time of year. And time permitting, I like to kind of do a roundup piece or two about what the vendors think is coming for us in the new year. And as recently as a few days ago, coming into the week, I thought I might be able to pull that off this week. Still might, but I'm becoming more and more skeptical because I'm trying to wrap up a million things before going on a holiday break. So if nothing else, I figured I would share a tiny sampling of some of these predictions that have been sent my way by vendors, and just sort of bounce their expectations against yours. First one here is from Cam Robertson, Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Beachhead Solutions. And his prediction is that I'm quoting here, as macroeconomic issues persist, the year is going to keep bubbling up some honest and perhaps uncomfortable conversations between providers and their customers. Businesses will be looking to reduce overhead costs wherever they can, but I do expect most MSPs will push back on cutting security, which is something that we've been talking about here. And Cam goes on to provide some additional advice in terms of being proactive about those conversations. I do think that, there are going to be these kinds of conversations coming up for a lot of channel pros out there from customers who, particularly if we get into a meaningful recession and that sticks around for a while, that always raises cash flow issues for customers, and that can translate into conversations with the MSP about what we can or can't keep doing. And Cam's advice is to be proactive about that, be the trusted advisor, kind of help them recognize, why the security expenses in particular are ones that you don't want to be cutting back, but don't wait for it to hit you. This, I suspect most of us will agree with this as well. Dave McKinnon, Chief Security Officer at Enable, says, I expect in 2023, MSPs will continue to be a top target for cyber criminals. Attackers will likely continue to adapt and evolve to the cloud, just as businesses are doing the same. And it's important to keep in mind that on-premises environments are also still at risk. Because without proper patching and configuration management, those systems remain a prime target. And that was something that was really driven home for anyone here who did not attend ChannelPro's latest Cybersecurity Online Summit on December 7th, just a few days back. And shame on you if you missed it. But we had an interesting conversation with some security experts, and this came up. There was a story told about someone who was compromised because an RMM system was compromised, and the security expert was just kind of ticking off all the mistakes, the very easy to make mistakes in terms of securing and configuring an on-prem RMM system. And so some of the most of the high profile RMM breaches we've heard about have involved cloud-based systems, but you got to worry about the on-prem ones as well, because it's very much up to you how you deploy and configure and secure those systems, and it's easy to overlook something. Let's see, an interesting prediction from Romain Bassett at Vade, email security company, and I won't quote this at length, but he basically thinks you're going to see more and more successful attacks that rely on circumventing MFA, and this is just something I've been bumping into this topic more and more recently in recent weeks, past few months, is just how many, the most well-known sort of way to get around MFA is to just keep bombarding the end user with MFA requests and wait for the authentication fatigue to set in, and they just say, yeah, sure. But there are proxy, there are techniques that I am not sophisticated enough to understand that allow you an attacker to get around an MFA system, and this is apparently happening more and more often, which is something to be concerned about. And then given how in the past we've been told that MFA is sort of the single most effective protection you can put in place, and will eliminate 99% of incidents if you've got it up and running. Prediction from Aidan Kehoe of Barracuda, and this kind of came up before. The quote unquote, going into 2023, the capacity of cyber insurance will continue shrinking as a result of increased demand and expected losses. This will cause premiums to skyrocket, and unfortunately, many organizations will not be able to afford the exact policies they held last year. So again, it's going to get harder and harder to get the coverage. The coverage that you got, if you keep it, is going to be more and more expensive. And you couple this with Cam's point about recession and cash flow and so on, and can they afford to spend the money it's going to take them to remain insured? It's going to be an interesting and a thorny issue. Prediction from Ian Alexander, channel chief at Synchro, that the hiring situation ain't getting any easier for ChannelPros next year, which probably not. I'd be interested to know if anyone out there is seeing a lot of relief on that front, but I certainly haven't been hearing that recently. And then last but not least, Brian Helwig, the CEO of MSP 360, sent out a prediction, and this is kind of interesting. Without a doubt, we'll continue to see ransomware drive innovation in 2023. And his point basically is, as ransomware persists, as the authors and perpetrators of ransomware continue to innovate on their end and get more sophisticated, that's going to drive companies like his to get more sophisticated in terms of how they use things like machine learning and artificial intelligence and threat intelligence, and just continue to look for new techniques to defeat these attacks, basically. So a ever so slight, faint silver lining maybe to ransomware is that it will push cybersecurity vendors, Brian thinks, to get better at what they do, because they'll have to even attempt to stay out in front or remain close to being out in front.
Josh, any thoughts on some of those predictions?
Yeah, I made some notes again.
Good.
So MFA bypass is interesting because yes, that is certainly happening more, at least we're reading more about it. And one of the earliest, everybody probably remembers when MFA meant SMS, right? It was, you got a 6-digit code by SMS. Well, not so much anymore. I mean, I don't know if we do that. Yeah, it's embedded in one or two things we have. And for those that aren't more techie listening, we're watching. That means not through your app on the phone, not TOTP, or not the one-time password, time limited that you get through Google, Microsoft Authenticator, or Authy, or whatever, but just a text code. Because you can clone SIMs or clone phones effectively, it is possible to intercept that traffic pretty easily, and there are other ways that are even easier. So that's mostly gone, but we are pretty dependent on TOTP. Now, there's also the possibility of tokens and other things that receive these second factors. So it doesn't have to be a phone, but they all rely on that same, it's all, the underlying technology is all the same, essentially, for the most part. And we're starting to see that get breached. And it is pretty spooky because I talked earlier about spending the whole year, and even a little last year, fighting to get people to MFA. It'll be very difficult to serve up that crow or to consume that crow next year if it turns out that MFA just isn't going to cut it. So I hope that there are good responses here, but I don't know for a fact there will be. It's spooky, you're right. Ransomware. So again, I'm going to call it 2.0. We are at the point where it is possible to protect endpoints and local servers and some cloud hosted delivery from effective encryption that can't be addressed. I don't mean necessarily reversed. Encryption is generally unbreakable if properly instituted, but we can recover. We have BCDR capabilities. We have offline air-gapped or not backups that can withstand that. What we don't have a good response to is what I call ransomware 2.0, or data exfiltration, or let's call it extortion as a service, because that's where the money is going to be. And like MFA, the idea that BCDR was the answer to ransomware was rapidly circumvented by the fact that there's another risk. Well, MFA, once it becomes circumvented, will need the next thing, which is probably going to be biometrics, and we'll see where that heads. But even though I know biometrics is the answer to MFA compromise, most likely, what's the answer to ransomware 2.0 or data exfiltration? I don't have a good answer. I was being a little tongue-in-cheek when I said, file level or higher level encryption on top of like native encryption in the OS, but I don't know that that's going to be enough either. It's going to be interesting to see how that gets resolved. And cyber insurance. Earlier, I said that unfortunately, the response to a lot of companies to the cost and complexity of obtaining and qualifying for, in that order, cyber insurance is leading them to decide they don't need it, or they're not going to afford it anyway. Actually, my prediction is not that it'll become unaffordable. I believe it'll become unavailable. I'm already seeing a lot of players, a lot of carriers pull out of that market. And just like we've seen in the United States with healthcare, it's become harder to find 5 providers in a metro market. It's harder to find 2 in my metro market now. There are 2 as of 2023. It's getting harder to actually cover the losses. So you can cover some of that by raising your rates and limiting your coverages, not so much with ACA as cyber. But eventually, the answer is you're not going to be able to get it. And people who are real targets, like MSPs, are already seeing that our carrier lists are dropping from dozens to handfuls or less here. So it's going to drive, my prediction is it's going to drive the companies that do everything from brokering and reinsurance to advising into a stronger position. And we're going to have to learn to deal with people who are brokers of this, not with individual carriers. And not just general purpose brokers, but people who broker cyber crime and maybe E&O for a living, because they're the only ones left that are going to be offering it. And yeah, it's going to cost. So I don't see a workaround to this. I don't think that this is fixable. And maybe we're in that 5 or 10 year horizon where insurance just won't be a thing 10 years from here. I don't know. It certainly won't be a reasonably inexpensive thing.
I'll put a crazy prediction out there that might, could be the interim step between where we are now and that insurance not being available anymore. And I wonder if we're going to start seeing next year insurance companies purchasing MSPs or security vendors purchasing insurance companies, and like born in the cloud cyber insurance. I'm wondering if you're going to start to see some team ups happening where the insurance companies that understand that they don't understand very much about security will actually just import some of that expertise by purchasing an MSP, and then kind of get into the managed security business, because if it's our people, we're going to be able to manage that risk more effectively. This year in 2022, we've seen in the news, I've spoken to security vendors about these relationships they're forming with security companies, where the insurance companies are basically saying, teach us, because we need to understand this better. We're taking big losses on this insurance. And so you wonder if instead of having alliance relationships, if they start actually just kind of joining forces and becoming the same company, and could there be security companies, security vendors out there that can offer. There are already examples of security vendors who will sell you coverage, but it's not like their products. They have a relationship with somebody. Do security vendors, start essentially becoming insurance companies as well? I don't know if all of that will happen, but I have this hunch you're going to start to see some of the lines between these different players in the market break down. And then the question becomes, does that fix things? Or, as you predict, Josh, and this could absolutely happen, wouldn't stun me at all, this kind of insurance just kind of goes away. I have both my parents are in their 80s. 30 years ago, they bought like the Cadillac of long-term care insurance policies. Thank goodness, because it's really financially helpful for them right now. And I'm at an age where it's starting to make sense to maybe investigate that too. And you cannot get those policies anymore. It's like, there is long-term care insurance coverage out there, but it isn't even remotely close. That business just doesn't exist anymore because of the impact it had in the insurance industry. And that could absolutely happen to cyber liability coverage down the road.
Well, when people talk about healthcare costs, there's a really good analogy here. I try to remind them, you can't tell me your insurance is too expensive if you don't accept the fact that a $90,000 hip is too expensive, or a $50,000 broken wrist is too expensive. If it costs $25,000 to repair the radiator on your F-150, you would not be able to afford your auto insurance. With cyber liability, these potential losses are so great, and can be so expensive, that you have that double whammy of unpredictability and extraordinary exposure, or potentially extraordinary exposure. So what is an underwriter going to do? One of the nice things about life insurance as insurance providers is that at least they know they're going to eventually have to pay out, right? There's nobody still alive that bought one of those policies 150 years ago. That's just not happening. But everything else is variable. Property and casualty. Will there be a tornado? Will your car get stolen? You don't know these things. And with cyber, there's that third dimension of unpredictability. If your car gets stolen, we at least know how much it's going to cost the insurance company. Even if they buy you a new, in my case, they buy us an RS5, they know that's 80 grand, right? They don't know if it's going to be 20, 40, 80, or 35,000, 350,000. They know what it costs. Cyber is the worst bogeyman of all. It could be a 50 grand loss. It could be a $5 million loss. There is no guarantee it'll happen, but there's certainly no guarantee it won't. And there isn't any time frame at which it just kind of expires as a risk. I'm amazed that we can currently get these coverages, but I don't think they have a long life in the form in which they're coming at us now. I think the other thing is going to happen, Rich. I think reinsurers and insurers are going to get together and become a single entity, and they're going to work in pool risks. And instead of 40 or 80 or 100 players in that space, there's going to be 4 or 8 or 10. To quote from Demolition Man, in the future, all restaurants will be Taco Bell. So I think that there'll be 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 big players, and that's it. And that's the only way that offering will exist. And I think the requirements will be extremely challenging, like CMMC level 3 will be next year. And I think that the costs will be extreme. But then 10 years from now, I don't know. I mean, what's going to happen? I don't know what TCP/IP is going to look like in 10 years, or cloud service delivery, or even internet. Honestly, it's the good guys aren't winning yet. And I'm just hopeful that the curves are intersecting, at least between the good and the bad. I'm not sure.
Well, I am sure of one thing. Now I want Taco Bell. So I'm going to go work on that here as soon as we wrap up this particular show. No, great points, Joshua. I completely agree with you. I think cyber insurance is going to be something that kind of becomes unattainable for the vast majority of people, because it's something that you just, if you can't calculate the losses and the risk, it's going to be too expensive for most people, and they'll just probably not have it. So that's a good prediction. We'll see what happens with the rest. But I do want to move on, because we got a really great interview coming up with Mike Semel of Semel Consulting. We're going to be talking regulations and kind of a little bit more stuff on this vein. So stick around. We will be right back. And welcome back to part 2 of this episode of ChannelPro Weekly. You know, Channel Pros know how difficult it is to stay on top of the latest technologies and security threats, but many also have to keep up with the latest developments in the evolving worlds of regulations like HIPAA and CMMC. And here to bring us up to date is Mike Semel of Semel Consulting. Welcome, Mike.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Great to have you back on the show. It's been a little while. For those who may not be familiar with you, why don't you tell us a little bit more about you and what you do?
So I was a value-added reseller, and then we suddenly became a managed service provider. So if anybody asked me today if I was an MSP, I'd say yes, I was, but we didn't even know we were an MSP when I started in this industry, because we didn't have managed services. It was all break, fix, and selling computers. I started out in the computer industry around 1979 and have been through all the different iterations of the computer industry. So we were a reseller and then a managed service provider. I learned about compliance in the early 2000s and went to a training class, came back and repositioned my marketing, my company, as a compliance company, not an IT company, and then sent out some postcards saying that we can help with HIPAA compliance. And the first deal I got was a $30,000 deal in 2004 with a county government to help them comply with HIPAA. I knew I was onto something. By the way, we didn't change any of our products and services. We just said we were compliance specialists, not just IT specialists. So we took ourselves away from a lot of our competitors who were advertising their IT stuff. Through that relationship and through that change, I became the chief information officer for a hospital and then for a K-12 school district. And since 2012, I've been a consultant focusing on regulated organizations. And more, to be honest, every single business in the United States has to comply with at least some regulation. And the way that we define compliance is really simple. It's anything someone else makes you do. So that would be federal and state laws. So you mentioned HIPAA, CMMC, industry regulations like PCI, payment card industry regulations that protect credit card information, but also licenses, attorneys' licenses, accountants' licenses, or industry regulations that have confidentiality tied to them. And those things now relate to cybersecurity. And then contracts. So we've had a lot of clients that have gotten those cybersecurity questionnaires from their business partners. Those are tied to their contracts. And finally, the big one is cyber insurance. I just got off a call with a client that has a $2 million policy, and I showed them that the network scans that they provided to us showed that they weren't doing everything they said they were doing on their cyber insurance application, which was putting them at risk. So we lump everything together. If you have a doctor in New York that takes credit cards and has a cyber insurance policy, they have to comply with HIPAA because they're a medical facility. They have to comply with the New York Shield Act. They have to comply with PCI because they take credit cards, and they have to comply with their cyber insurance policy requirements, or else the policy won't pay if they need it. So we're a holistic compliance consultant, and we do a lot of our work. Most of our work comes as referrals from MSPs.
Wow, very, very interesting. And really cool background. Now, you also wrote a book on this topic, correct?
I did. I've written a book called How to Avoid HIPAA Headaches. And HIPAA, like every other law and regulation, is really boring. So I did my best to make this more interesting by simply taking HIPAA incidents and penalties. You know, somebody got fined $3 million for a HIPAA violation, and then I deconstructed what the root causes were, so you could learn how to avoid that yourself.
Wow. Now Joshua has a copy of that book. Joshua, you can hold that up again for us one more time there.
Yeah, let me turn off the background. This will make it a lot easier. And there we go.
Oh, there it is. Very cool.
Yeah. It was it's been at least a few years before.
Thanks for the ad, Josh.
Good. Yeah, but this was a fun read, as much as something about this could be a fun read, because it's all about what happens when you don't. And you basically, it's a great thing to share with people. The HIPAA wall of shame, which I think you led me 2 years ago, and this book together have served as admonishment. You know, this can happen if you don't pay attention.
Mm-hmm. So, Mike, you are always a great source of information, insights about compliance. The reason you're on this particular episode of the show now is because you reached out to me not too long ago, and you said that there have been significant developments both on the HIPAA front and the CMMC front. And, you know, anytime Mike Semel tells me there have been significant developments in those areas, I figure we should probably talk about it on the podcast. So let's start with HIPAA. And I have very little background around what's been announced or changed. I just know it has something to do with healthcare providers and rewards maybe that they can get if they adopt a cybersecurity framework.
Yeah. So, Rich, I'm not so sure I'd call it a reward. What I'm really going to tell you is you can avoid some penalties. So it's more risk management than reward. I think when I get a reward, somebody's going to hand me a check, or somebody's going to do something really nice for me. In this case, it's kind of, here's the bad things that won't happen to you. So let me give you a little bit of history going back into HIPAA. So HIPAA has 3 rules: the privacy rule, the breach notification rule, and the security rule. The privacy rule is that general rule that says patient information needs to be kept confidential, but it also says as patients, we have a legal right to get a copy of our medical records. So there's not too much that MSPs have to deal with the privacy rule if they're offering any HIPAA services to their clients. The breach notification rule is the rule that says if you do have an incident, if you have a data breach, for example, that the patients have to be notified and you have to report it to the federal government. And again, this is something more on the client side. But then there's the security rule. And the security rule is what I focused on when I turned my company into a, quote, compliance specialist way back in the early 2000s. It came into effect in 2005, and it protects data. And it's got about 40 different things in it that are required. Now, HIPAA, like other regulations, is vague. And when you read the regulations, you don't always know exactly what they mean. But one of the things I put in the book, and I continue to follow as penalties are issued, is I go in and read the penalty documents. And that tells me exactly what the enforcers are looking for. For example, if you read the HIPAA law and you read the security rule, it's very vague on encryption. It says that data should be encrypted, but if you can come up with other alternative ways to protect it, you don't have to encrypt it. Now, over the years, all sorts of ways that people have tried to protect unencrypted data have failed. So people say, well, we lock our laptops. There was a HIPAA penalty against Blue Cross in New Jersey when somebody came in literally with bolt cutters and cut through the cables on their secured laptops, but the laptops were unencrypted and there was a data breach. So even good physical security doesn't help you. but there was a HIPAA penalty against an organization called Lifespan that did lose an unencrypted laptop. And the penalty said, right in the penalty document, $1.5 million penalty, was that you failed to encrypt all devices used for business purposes. So that tells us that now the regulators expect everything to be encrypted. The problem with the HIPAA security rule is not only is it vague, it was written back in 2005, or it became official in 2005, so it was probably written a couple of years before that. Everything's changed. Now, it's the federal government. It's not easy to change regulations. Now, at the same time that people were saying that the HIPAA security rule needed to be updated, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, came out with its cybersecurity framework, the NIST CSF. Now, that's more modern. It's almost 10 years newer than the HIPAA security rule, and it's got 110 or 108 in the NIST CSF, 108 requirements for securing data. These are all basic requirements. Inventory your hardware, inventory your software, identify your data flows. How does data come into your organization? Where does it go and how does it leave your organization? These are all basic things that like MSPs do all the time. Not every healthcare provider has been doing it. So the conundrum was that it takes a lot of work for the federal government to change the HIPAA security rule. And here's this NIST cybersecurity framework out here. So in the beginning of 2021, January 5th of 2021, and what's significant about that date is you may have heard about something that happened on January 6th of 2021 that kind of stole the headlines and still is stealing headlines. So on January 5th, the president signed into law, a law that was passed by both houses of Congress, you know how hard that is, that said that if a healthcare provider implements what they're calling a recognized security practice, so now we have a new acronym, RSP, and they can prove that they have done it for the prior year, 12 months prior to an audit or an incident, that if they're audited, they will automatically pass the audit. And if there's an incident, then the regulators have to consider that they did the right things in the penalty phase. They didn't come out and say 100%, no penalties, but they said essentially that if you did these things and you still got hacked, you're not going to get into trouble. One of the things that people think's unfair about HIPAA, but other regulations too, is that a healthcare provider will get hacked or have some criminal activity. Sometimes it's an employee that steals patient information and then releases it. Well, the organization gets penalized for not securing it well enough. And people get mad. It's like if you have your wallet or your purse stolen, and then you get in trouble because you didn't secure it well enough. So that's been a big issue with HIPAA and other regulations that protect data. So what this law says is that if you implement these things, now the problem with a law being passed is then the agency that has to enforce it has to come out with the rules and explain how they're going to do it so people know what they're looking for and how to communicate with them and so forth. That's what I contacted you about, because the rules were now made official a couple of months ago through a video done by the Office for Civil Rights that enforces HIPAA, and says that if a healthcare provider can prove it's implemented an RSP, a recognized security practice, then it can get these benefits of passing audits automatically and having any penalties reduced. Huge financial benefits. First of all, an audit can cost money. It causes a huge amount of stress because I've worked with our clients when they've been audited. But also, if you have an incident, the penalties are in the millions of dollars. And then you don't think about this, then there's the lawsuit. And the lawsuit that follows on is often much more costly than the federal penalty. So we've seen all this. So what's a recognized security practice? So the law itself is very explicit, and it says that it must come from a statutory authority. Now, statutory authority means that it's an authority that was created by law. So what that does is that limits the frameworks and the ways that you can implement this. So the NIST cybersecurity framework is from the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. That's one of the two choices that they're approving, and because NIST was created by law. There's another thing called Section 405, and that's through the Department of Health and Human Services. That's another cybersecurity framework that they're claiming is easier for doctors. But here's the problem. The problem is, and I've seen this because we work with attorneys a lot, and I've talked to attorneys and say, what do you recommend to your clients? And they always say the NIST cybersecurity framework. And the reason for it is that it's a US government standard and it doesn't just apply to health information. So employee information, remember every hospital and doctor's office has employees, and there's other information besides patient information that has to be protected. So the bottom line is that if you are an MSP and you help your healthcare clients implement the NIST cybersecurity framework, it's not a complete get out of jail free card, but it's about the best, if you'll pardon me, vaccine against audits and penalties. And this is new, and it's something that you can go back to those people that you're already working with and get them to implement better cybersecurity. You can also go to organizations that maybe turned you down or that you've been afraid to go to before, because if you can help them with that NIST cybersecurity framework, which is pretty easy to do, frankly, you've got a new service you can offer, which gives them huge financial benefits for taking advantage of it.
So, one of the key things that you said there is that in order to benefit from those new rules, you have to prove that one of these two frameworks is in place. What qualifies as proof?
So it's a great question, Rich. And here's the problem. You and I talking, because we trust each other, we could say, well, I'm going to prove this to you, or you're going to trust me, or I'm going to show you that I'm doing something. But that's not how it works in a regulated industry. It also doesn't work when you're getting sued. And the first demand by regulators is always a letter demanding documentation. If you're ever sued, or you've been sued, or you've sued anybody, the first demand is always for documentation. Doesn't matter whether it's an injury lawsuit, a business lawsuit, a divorce suit. If it's a divorce, we want to see tax returns because we want to prove what your income is so we can do the financial settlement. If it's an injury case, they also want to see tax returns, by the way, because they want to see what the cost is, if you're not able to work. With regulators, and in particular this case, the demand is going to be, send us 12 months worth of evidence that cybersecurity is in place. Now, here's the problem. The problem is that even if we've been doing it, so we're in December right now. If we've been doing it since January or last December, so we've been doing something for 12 months, how do you print a report out right now that shows you've been doing something for 12 months? You can't. But in January, you could have printed the January report. February, you could have printed the February reports. What tools do you use to get the reports? There are lots of them. There are your RMM tool, your remote monitoring and management tool that can print out the inventories and show that the security is in place. You have security tools. You can get custom assessment and compliance tools that are purpose-built for doing this, but you can't suddenly come up with it when your client needs it. So this is a service, and this is where, as an MSP, you want to track your tickets and all those things, because if it isn't documented, it didn't happen, right? Now you can offer documentation as a service because it has a separate value from the technical services you're offering.
So it sounds like there are a couple of different revenue opportunities there, and one is a recurring revenue opportunity because you are continuously assembling and maintaining this information that would be useful in an audit. But there's also maybe a one-time project and engagement that you can do to implement NIST, their cybersecurity framework, for example.
Exactly. And by doing that, remember, we're talking about this in the context of HIPAA, but let's say that there was a breach of employee information. In other words, not HIPAA information at a hospital, the employee records were breached. Then you're going to have the protection. And this is one of the things that we found with healthcare clients. Everybody has these blinders on, and the blinders are that we need to protect health information, our patient information. Well, you do, because it is legally protected and it's a it's a risk to you. But what about the people that work there, including you? So you're working for ChannelPro. You don't want ChannelPro just to promote or just to protect the subscriber information. You want them to protect all the information they have because your social security number's in there. Unless you suddenly became a volunteer and you're not being paid anymore, they have that. So this is a holistic approach to data protection, which I think is more effective than just implementing the HIPAA security rule, because that's just focused on protected health information.
And based on what you were saying earlier, from a cost benefit standpoint, like you said, implementing NIST is not that onerous. So it sounds like from a cost benefit standpoint, that this is worth doing for everyone involved.
Right. Here's what I like about this. I've gone to executives and business owners at different types of organizations. So we work with healthcare organizations that have to comply with HIPAA. And by the way, there's state laws and other things that come into the mix. Also, defense contractors that have to do CMMC. Now, they can't do the NIST cybersecurity framework. They have to implement a framework under a different NIST publication called 800-171. But when we're talking to business owners and also in the financial sector, banks, credit unions, lending organizations, even colleges where they have financial information in the financial aid office. If you want a scholarship, for example, you fill out a credit application to do that because they want to find out if you qualify for financial aid. So there are a lot of different non-traditional financial organizations, but here's what's common. You can use the NIST cybersecurity framework as like the Swiss Army knife, no matter what industry you're in, with the exception of defense contracting, which has a slightly different requirement. You could use that NIST cybersecurity framework across every type of business that you work with. And here's the power of it. I've gone to executives and said, hey, here's the benefit of implementing this framework. It's 108 items, federal government, and it's free, by the way. You can download it for free. There's no cost to get the documentation or anything. If you implement this, here are all the protections. You get regulatory protection against these penalties if you have an incident. But your lawyer, because I've spoken with lawyers, when I say I've spoken, I did a presentation at the New York State Cybersecurity Conference this year with an attorney. And we were talking about the questions on cyber insurance applications and things like that. And I asked him, what framework do you recommend to your clients? He said, it's always the NIST cybersecurity framework. I said, why? There are a lot of other frameworks. Center for Internet Security, CIS, has the CIS controls. It's a similar framework to NIST because all frameworks essentially kind of do the same things, but it's worded differently and it has some different ways to implement it. He said, oh, I don't recommend that because I want to tell a judge or a jury that you followed a US government standard. He said, .gov, NIST.gov is much more powerful to me in court than CIS.org. I thought that was interesting because that brought a different perspective to this, saying it's not just cybersecurity, but it's legal protection as well. And that's also what HIPAA says. You can't implement something like the CIS controls and show the evidence of that for 12 months because they're going to say that's not a recognized security practice.
NIST spells CYA, you're saying. Okay.
Good thought. But here's what I've done. I've said to the business owners, and through my consulting company, I don't sell any IT products and services. So we're advisors, and I'll say, you need to do this. Look, okay, that's a great idea. We want that protection. We don't want to, if we can beat a HIPAA audit right out of the gate by showing them this evidence, that's going to save us a lot of time and money. And certainly if we have an incident, it could save us millions. So yeah, we want to do it. Then an MSP comes in and says, well, you need to encrypt data. You need this level of security you don't have now. And the business owner or the executive said, well, wow, that's really expensive. And I said, yeah, but you said you wanted to save the millions of dollars by implementing the framework. That's part of it. Oh, okay. I'm serious. It's been able to close deals for MSPs because instead of an individual sale, when you sell someone on the NIST cybersecurity framework as a concept, they've agreed to do 108 things.
Well, let's transition over to CMMC. The news there, as I understand it, and there's something kind of predictable about this. The news has to do with timelines and dates, and it seems like that's always the news about CMMC is, new dates and timelines and clarification on that. So it sounds like there's some news on that front, and then also some lessons learned from some of the pilot assessments that have been performed.
Yeah, exactly. So CMMC is for defense contractors. Now, I'm going to have to use some lingo here because there's no way to get around it. CMMC is an acronym. It stands for the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. And the key word in this is certification, because the Department of Defense has had regulations since 2017 that required the implementation of NIST 800-171. So we were just talking about the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. That's a publication that NIST put out. They put that in English. It's a cybersecurity framework. They don't always speak English. So NIST 800-171, actually special publication 800-171, is the name of the document that has the 110 requirements for defense contractors, and specifically defense contractors that handle what they call controlled unclassified information, or CUI. So this rule has been in effect for years. And since 2017, it's been a requirement for defense contractors. Now, when we think of defense contractors, we always think of the big guys. We think of Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, these huge companies. And yes, they're defense contractors and they're the ones that get the headlines. But 98%, maybe 99% of defense contractors are smaller organizations, and a lot of them do subcontracting to these other organizations. So when Boeing gets a contract for a fighter jet, within the contract from the Department of Defense, it said you need to subcontract parts and pieces of this contract out to small businesses. And then you get into a whole competition, because if you're a veteran-owned company or a women-owned company or a minority or in a hub zone or whatever, you're going to get some priority on that contract. So when you think about this, there are lots of defense contractors. You think of 10 or 20, there are over 300,000 defense contractors across the world that contract with the U.S. Department of Defense. The acronym for that is the Defense Industrial Base, the DIB. So 300,000 companies. Now, go back to what I said, that the ones that handle controlled unclassified information need to comply or need to implement the NIST 800-171 framework. That's about a third of them. So it's roughly 100,000. So this goes back to 2017. The federal government in around 2019 started to audit these organizations. The Department of Defense did. And you know what they found out? Like 1% of them had actually done it. They all signed contracts, defense contracts, that said that they would comply with this, and they didn't do it. And nobody was looking. That's how you get away with stuff. We were all kids.
That's self-attestation, by the way, which can also be spelled LIAR, is the problem that we were fighting, is that folks were willing to attest to this when they thought there were no teeth in it.
Happened with the self-attestation was that people weren't doing it. And what did the Department of Defense do? They overcorrected. So how did they overcorrect? They decided to do two things. One is an interim rule, which is in effect right now. You have to self-attest and actually post a score. And they've told the companies that are doing the contracting, the Boeings and the Raytheons and all this, don't give contracts to anybody that hasn't posted a score, even if it's bad score up in a federal system. If they haven't posted a score, then you're not going to do business with them. So the first thing is they've added a little bit of meat to this by saying now you have to attest to your self-attestation. By the way, if you attest and then they come in and audit you and find out you haven't done those things, you're guilty of fraud against the federal government under the False Claims Act. That's a huge issue, whole different conversation. But with CMMC, what they did is they said, okay, we're not going to trust anybody anymore. To Josh's point, everybody lied. We're going to certify you. We're going to come in and do a complete independent assessment of your cybersecurity. And unless you have a certification, you won't get a contract. So in 2020, they came out with this idea. They formed a separate organization, a nonprofit, company called the CMMC accreditation body to build this whole ecosystem of assessors. And they said, we're going to take this out to private industry to do. So they didn't want to do it with the military. They didn't want to contract out with the big contracting companies like an Accenture or somebody like that and just give them the contract to do it. So the CMMC accreditation body came out. They wrote this regulation and basically put no cushion in it. And what I mean by that was it was pass fail. You either did all 110 things perfectly or you failed. And they had an aggressive time frame, and they said everybody, even companies that don't have CUI, controlled unclassified information, but are performing other services. Think about companies sweeping the floors at Air Force bases and food service companies and the landscaping companies. If you have a contract with the DoD anywhere, you're going to get an audit. You're going to have to go through an assessment. 300,000 companies. And then they said, we're going to do this in 5 years. So all of a sudden, I started to think, well, there's a big math problem here. How you can do 300,000 audits in 5 years? Where you don't even have an auditing organization yet, you got to build a whole ecosystem. So I started predicting in 2021, something was going to have to change. Middle of 2021, I didn't see this as being viable. So they came out with CMMC 2.0, where they said only the companies that have the unclassified information will be assessed, which brings it down to about 100,000. And then we're going to write these rules, and they included like MSPs in the scope of this. So if you're an MSP and you're providing your services to one of these small defense contractors, you're going to get dragged into their audit. So they came up with this whole thing in November of 2021, just over a year ago. And at the same time, they're trying to build capacity and train assessors. Well, that's the problem. Because right now, they're 3 years into this, they have 29 assessor organizations to do over 100,000 assessments. So right now, the rules are being moved through the government, and it's possible that they're going to be approved by the middle of 2023. They're saying May or June of 2023, CMMC may be put into contracts. If it doesn't happen in 2023, it's going to get kicked out a full year. In the meantime, we have this interim rule, the self-assessment requirement. But here's the rub. 29 companies that can do assessments, and the rule isn't even in full effect yet. So they can't do an official assessment till the middle of next year. And it's been 3 years to even get 29 companies approved. So number one, it's an opportunity for MSPs, because you have the current requirement that if they don't implement NIST 800-171, now the official Department of Defense requirement says you must post a score. Now we've got clients. I just saw a Northrop Grumman vendor demand letter basically that says to our client that we're doing a CMMC preparation assessment for, if you don't implement NIST 800-171 right now, all 110 requirements. We don't care about CMMC that may be coming next year or the year after. If you don't do this stuff now and prove it to us, we're not going to send you a contract. So there's now 2 layers of enforcement here. You've got the DoD at the top end, but you also have the main, they call them prime contractors telling their subcontractors. So we're looking at the middle of next year. So Rich said that there's some information that's been learned about this, and they've been doing some test assessments. And what the test assessments found were a couple of things. One is that if you're dealing with CUI, controlled unclassified information, the requirement isn't just that you have to encrypt the data, it's that you have to encrypt it at what they call FIPS, FIPS 140-2 encryption level. That's a certified encryption from NIST. And if you go out to NIST and you look for FIPS 140-2, you're going to find that there are a lot of products out there that have been approved. But here's my experience. Companies like Microsoft that have done a lot of work with the DoD have FIPS 140-2 encryption. Now, you can't use the standard Microsoft Office, the commercial product. You have to use what they call GCC, the government cloud. And it's going to be FIPS 140-2. A lot of the backup companies and other companies that do file sharing and things like that have not built FIPS 140-2 into their services. The reason I'm bringing this up is this is one of the top findings that they had to ding defense contractors on when they did the test audits. The second thing was, we've already talked about this, in a regulated environment, it's not what you're doing, it's what you documented. So what they found was that when the auditors went out and said, show us what you're doing, people could show them things. They said, okay, we want to see the documentation. And the audit manuals are all public. You can go out and find the HIPAA audit process for healthcare. You can go out and find the CMMC audit process for defense contractors, and they all say the same things. Look for written policies and procedures and evidence. So when I'm training MSPs, I use a picture of a three-legged stool. What's the characteristic of a three-legged stool? If you take one of the legs away, it won't stand up. What are the three legs? Policies, procedures, and evidence. Policy, we're going to do something. Procedure, here's how we're going to do it. Evidence, here's proof we're doing it. Use a simple example. Endpoint protection software. I used to call it antivirus software. I'm an old guy like Josh. So antivirus software. Okay, what's the regulation say? You must install antivirus software in all your endpoints. What's the procedure? We're going to install, now fill in the blank, and I won't talk about it. Rich, who's one of your antivirus sponsors for ChannelPro?
I don't want to call any of them out, but they're all wonderful companies. So
okay, but all I'm going to say is the procedure is we're going to implement blank and fill in the blank with one of those names as our procedure. Now, what's evidence? Evidence is that organization, that product has a central console, or maybe your RMM tool has the ability to go out and look at the devices and create a report that shows that the endpoint protection software is installed, it's turned on, and it's got the latest updates. Those are the three things for that particular requirement. Multiply that times 108 for the NIST cybersecurity framework, 110 for the NIST 800-171 for defense contractors, and you can see that there's a lot of documentation that's required, and you can charge for that. Now, here's how I charged for it. I used to tell my clients, we're going to do all this stuff for you, and you need to have the documentation that shows that we did it, which is not included in our fee. It can cost you as much to create the documentation. We all have heard from our techs when we started implementing ticketing systems. It takes me longer to create a ticket than it took me to do the work. How many times has an MSP heard that? Well, it does sometimes. That's not an unfair statement. The problem is you're not going to get paid necessarily if you're trying to bill somebody and you don't have any documentation to prove it. Now that we're using, as MSPs, we're measuring the utilization of techs and everything, you better go and put your time in, because that's important to us for management purposes. So I would say to the prospects, you need to have all this documentation. You can do it. You can go out and buy the tools to do it. We have the tools to do it. Here's what it'll cost for us to handle it for you. So there was no expectation that included in our price for our technical services was the price for the documentation. And we utilize these tools to create the documentation and build the libraries. So this has to be an image, because nobody's printing things out anymore. If you are a healthcare provider and they say to you, show us 12 months worth of evidence, and you don't have it, or you only have a little bitty amount that you can hand them, you're not going to win as much as if you could show them, here's the equivalent of 1,000 pages a month of data. So we've used tools like rapid fire tools, network assessment tools, and compliance manager and things like that, where you can automate this stuff. And nobody really looks at all of it. A lot of it, there's some things you need to look at. You want to see the patch status. You want to see the antivirus status. But a lot of it is just to have more evidence to deluge on top of a regulator that's going to audit you, to have them say, stop, you passed, we're done. And I've done that before.
Now, it's a lot to think about, and it's a lot lot to digest, and you probably know more acronyms than any human being on the planet. So congratulations on that as well. But unfortunately, we are out of time. I know you have a hard stop coming up. But Mike, I want to say thank you so much for coming on and filling us in and telling us about this stuff. It's something that everybody's got to think about and is going to be dealing with as we go forward. So very, very important. And thanks for sharing that. Mike, for anybody who wants to reach out to you, learn more about you, maybe work with you, where can they go? How can they find you? Oh, it looks like we really did hit Mike's hard stop, because I think he just dropped. So we'll put a link to his website on the show notes page here for episode 250, right? And we will maybe drop a link to his book as well. Would be a good thing to do. So go and check that out. But we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll be joined on the other side still with Mr. Joshua Liberman. We will break down the show, have a little bit of fun, and you never know what's going to happen. So stick around. We will be right back. And we are now back with part 3 of this episode of Channel Pro Weekly. I mean, the conversation and insights between our guests today have just been absolutely amazing. And I'm so glad that everyone was able to kind of join us for this. The interview with Mike was awesome. I mean, I'm sure everybody got something out of it, learned something. Rich, Josh, was there anything you want to highlight out of that interview that you found interesting?
Just daunting. Listening to Mike is always, by the time he gets to the end of an explication of something, I feel like, holy mackerel, this is even more daunting than I thought it was. And I'm amazed that people can do compliance and not go home and slit their wrists. Of course, I feel the same way about what I do. It's really daunting. It's really a huge challenge. It's constantly moving, and the target is just untrackable. And he clearly has a depth of experience in there that I'm not sure I know is matched elsewhere. So basically, just yikes.
Yeah, for sure. Rich?
Yeah, well, I'll echo exactly what Josh is saying, and direct it in particular at CMMC, and this has to do with the fact of where it is in its evolution. Obviously, HIPAA, Mike, was kind of alluding roughly to when that law was written. That was passed into law during the Clinton administration, the 90s, like that. So we've had a lot of time to digest HIPAA. That doesn't make it easy to do at all. And obviously, Mike coming on the show indicates things are still changing. There's a lot of work to be done to comply and to keep up with changing conditions and rules and so on. But CMMC is still very, very young. And I think you use the exact right word, Josh, daunting.
Yeah.
The one thing he didn't mention, which is one of the reasons I really thought I was going to love the CMMC regimen, is that HIPAA is in a lot of ways toothless. Even though there are, and if you look at his book, you can see examples of real penalties. Most of the small medical practitioners, doctors, and clinics honestly believe that it's just not worth worrying about. They're not acting upon it. CMMC is the difference between maintaining a contract and not. And if you are crazy enough to defraud the government, then dealing with the federal offense that is brought to your plate. But what he didn't mention is that with CMMC, there is, at least on paper, a changing but happening process by which you can become certified, compliant. You can get a piece of paper, you can get adjudicated, we'll call it compliant. There is no analog in the HIPAA world. There's no such thing as being HIPAA certified and HIPAA compliant. You just make an effort towards a goal. And that is what our clients have called toothlessness of HIPAA is what kept me out of that. But what interests me about CMMC is that, at least at first, and I think still, it's an attainable goal. There's a bar you can clear and then get a certificate that said you did. And there are consequences to not doing that. So I think that as an MSP, an IT provider, that's a much better thing to chase.
Yeah, for sure. Well, great stuff. And unfortunately, we're pretty much out of time. So normally we like to do a little game. I have a little bit of fun with our guests, but unfortunately, we're going to have to not do that this time. But Joshua, I promise you, the next time we have you on, we'll have a little bit of fun, and we'll do that. But for now, we're just going to say goodbye. So Joshua, I want to say thank you so much for coming on. You always have great, amazing insights and thoughts on all of these topics. So it's always a pleasure when you're on. If anybody wanted to learn more about you, connect with you, where can they go? How can they find you?
Netsciences.com, or honestly, I don't mind sharing my email address. Well, let's share info@netsciences.com. That's easiest.
Easiest. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on. Can't wait to have you back. With that, we're gonna wrap this episode to number 250. Please subscribe wherever you are. We're on Apple Podcasts, we're on Stitcher, we're on Spotify. So make sure you subscribe to the podcast wherever you are. Go to channelpronetwork.com each and every day, make it your homepage. There you'll find the latest news, resources, articles, all kinds of great information to keep you on top of what's going on in this crazy business, and to help you get advice and strategies to grow your business and make more money and service your customers better, right? That's what it's all about. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in with us this week. We will have a holiday bonus episode coming up I think it'll come out next week, right, Rich? I'm getting my weeks confused.
You're absolutely right. Yep.
Yeah. So we will have a show next week. It's a holiday bonus special, and then we will, I believe, be out for the new year. But we will be back then. I hope everybody has a great holiday, and see you then. Bye.